audiobooks don't count as reading. I know that's a controversial opinion, but I'm going to explain why I think that in this video. So hi, I'm Marie, and on this channel I review sci-fi, fantasy, and horror. But today I'm going to talk about this question that keeps popping up with different people about, do audiobooks count as reading? I think behind that question is something else. This sense that if we are to say that audiobooks don't count as reading, that means audiobooks are worse than reading, and also that audiobooks are bad. And that's part of where I think the problem comes in. The second question is easier to talk about. Are audiobooks bad? No, obviously audiobooks are good. They allow a lot of people to be able to consume stories and informational texts and whatever else they want when they might not have otherwise been able to consume those things. So they're not bad. You're still consuming the story, you're still understanding the story and the characterization, you're still understanding the plot. There's nothing wrong with listening to an audiobook. To go back to the first question, are audiobooks worse than reading? I think this is more nuanced than the question seems. So if we're only talking about comprehension and nothing else, in terms of consuming a story, then research has shown that audiobooks offer similar comprehension opportunities to reading. But I do say comprehension opportunities on purpose because in the research that they've done, people are going into MRI machines and they're listening to an audiobook in the MRI machine, whereas other people are reading text across a screen that's going by at a certain clip, and they're measuring their brains when they're consuming in these two different ways. So the problem here for me is that I think most people, and this is what I do, I listen to audiobooks, is I don't just lay on my couch and stare at the ceiling while I'm listening to an audiobook. I'm driving, or I'm doing the dishes, or I'm getting ready for work, or I'm walking my dogs. I'm doing something else while I'm listening to the audiobook. Whereas when I'm reading, I am just sitting and all my visuals are only focusing on the pages in front of me and nothing else. And I do think that if they studied that, like the usage of audiobooks in the real world versus the usage of reading on the page in the real world, that we would see a difference in comprehension. I can't imagine that if I'm out walking my dog, listening to an audiobook with everything that's going on in the world around me and what I have to be aware of in safety, and my dog suddenly doing something that I didn't expected, that my comprehension is going to be the same as when I'm just sitting on my couch. Like, yeah, sure, if I'm sitting on my couch, something could happen. My dogs could do something in the house that also steals my attention. But I just think it's happening much more often, and it's much more likely when I'm like actively doing another activity at the same time as consuming the work. So in that sense, I think I would argue that comprehension is worse for an audiobook, and we just don't have the research on that yet. If research does come out in the real world and says that we actually do have the same comprehension, then I'll admit that I was wrong. It just seems unlikely that that would be the case. So yeah, I don't think that that will turn out to be the case. And I think that most people aren't just sitting and staring when they listen to an audiobook. But if they are, research shows that comprehension is not worse listening to an audiobook as it is reading from a text. I just think it's in the real world scenarios where some of that comprehension, some of the issues with comprehension might arise. So that's my first point, where I do see the potential for listening to be worse than reading in terms of comprehension. The other issue that I think comes up with comprehension is when we consider pacing, pausing, and reviewing while reading. So when I'm listening to an audiobook, I find it really annoying if I have to go back. So if I miss something in the book, and if I just think that it was some little description, I'm not gonna rewind the text or like hit the thing to go back 15 seconds, the button to go back 15 seconds. I'm just gonna keep going. I only go back like that if I think I missed something that's like really important to my understanding of the novel. I'm specifically speaking right now about fiction stories and not informational text. When I'm listening to an audiobook, I do find it annoying to have to go backwards. And I also don't ever pause an audiobook just to think about it. Or maybe I do, but it's very rare. I'm not just listening to my audiobook and then pausing it and continuing on in silence with what I'm doing while I think, and then starting the audiobook again. I just tend not to do that. I follow along with the narration and just follow along with the story, and that feels like a more passive experience. Like when I'm watching a movie, I don't pause the movie that I'm watching continuously to stop and think about what's going on in the movie and what I think about it. However, when I'm reading, I do this. I pause constantly. Sometimes it might only be for a few seconds. Sometimes it might be for longer. But I do regularly pause and consider what I'm reading and what I think about it. I contemplate the ideas and the characters, and I feel like I have that space to pause while I'm reading a book in a way that I don't with an audiobook. And I think that it's natural for me to do so when I'm reading, but not when I'm listening to an audiobook. So pausing and reviewing, I think, are both much easier when reading. And then when I think about pacing, I get to control the pace that I read at when I'm reading, whereas when I'm listening, the narrator controls the pace. So if I want to slow down because something's more complex or there's more details and I want to be able to focus on them, I can do that much more easily when I'm reading versus listening to an audiobook, where again, I'd have to rewind, or I would have to actually go into my phone settings and slow down the narration or speed up the narration depending on what I want. I'm just very unlikely to do that back and forth in the middle. I've never done that in an audiobook. I sometimes move the speed up and then I leave it up, but I don't go back and forth. Whereas when I'm reading, I definitely am varying my reading speed throughout the experience of the novel. So I just think that level of control over the pacing and the pausing and the reviewing when I'm reading gives me a deeper and more personal connection to the story, because it's not just like I'm being pulled through it by the narrator. And that does make a difference for me, and I think it makes a difference for me in how I comprehend the story. I think I still understand the plot details and the characterization generally when I'm listening, but it doesn't have the same depth as when I'm reading. So then next, if we looked beyond just talking about comprehension and into other aspects of why I read a story, I read fiction to feel things, to see truths, to understand other people, to use my imagination, to learn and to grow. I'm not just reading for comprehension, and I'm not just reading for entertainment or escape either. I see a lot of people talk about that, especially people who read fantasy, this idea that they read for escape. But I don't think that I do that. I mean, I do that. I think you automatically are escaping in some sense when you're consuming a story. If you're like immersed in the story, then it is an escape. But I'm not reading it on purpose to escape. I'm reading it for various other reasons, and especially I think understanding truths or seeing truths or thinking about truths in a way that I didn't previously is a huge part of what I look for when I'm reading. And part of that is also learning and growing for me. If we're looking at some of these ideas beyond comprehension, reading to me does something different than listening does. There's this idea of co-creating while reading. So the idea is like this, that the writer writes the story and then they put it out into the world, and then when the reader receives it and is in the process of reading it, the reader is co-creating that story with the writer, because we're using our imagination to think about the characters and the setting and what everything sounds like and what it feels like and what it looks like and how things move. Like, we do that, and that's a form of creation that we're adding to the story. So when we're listening, I'm not creating the sound in the same way. I'm not creating the tone of the characters in the same way. And again, the pacing. I'm not creating the pacing. The narrator is doing all that. They're putting that into it for me, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. And it could even be like a third layer of co-creation, which is pretty interesting to think about. But personally, I like my mind to build the narration and the tone of it and the sound of it with the author. And I do think that listening to an audiobook takes that away from me. So it's not always a bad thing, but in this case, that's definitely a personal taste of mine, that I enjoy having that experience of reading and setting the tone. But overall, I think listening makes my consumption of the story less personal, because I'm not using my imagination as much as I would if I'm reading it. Besides co-creating, there's also learning. As I said, I like to learn when I'm reading. And so I like to contemplate so many different things that are going on in the story, like philosophical ideas. I will stop and think about philosophical ideas that the story is promoting or just delving into or questioning. And I will think about the nature of humanity and what the story is saying about humans, and if I agree or disagree, and that kind of thing. And that helps me learn. So learn about myself and learn about others. And so I think without being able to do that pausing as much, I'm losing learning, my ability to learn while I consume the fiction. And that's really important to me. I also, again, pausing to sit with emotions and questions helps me have a deeper connection to the story and the ideas and the characters, and I can't do it as well when I listen to an audiobook. So I think I do lose learning when I'm listening to an audiobook. Not entirely. I can still learn if I finish a chapter and then I pause and I go out about my day and I might think about the book. So there's still learning happening, but I just think it's deeper when I'm reading. Then also feeling. I don't know if I feel deeper when I'm reading than listening, but I do know that when there is a piece of the story that I do feel deeply about, when I'm reading, I will go back and reread it. Whether it might just be a line or it might be a whole scene. Usually I won't reread a whole chapter. I have, but that's not usual for me. But a scene that really strikes me, I will reread it in the moment to feel that feeling again and to kind of dig into it a little more deeply. I'm saying deeply a lot, but to dig into it more deeply. And again, I could do this with an audiobook. I could rewind, but I tend not to. It tends to feel, one, annoying to have to do that, and two, I'm being carried along. Just like it's very rare for me to rewind a movie or to rewind a TV show unless I really miss something, or if it's an unbelievable scene. Even then, I really don't do that. I really don't do it. I've never thought about it that much until now, but yeah, I tend to go back when I'm reading a book and experience pieces of it much more than I do when somebody else is carrying me through the story, like I believe happens in listening and then also in like film and TV shows. So I think that's another benefit to reading over listening personally. And then finally, my last point, which is a smaller one for me, but it's one that I enjoy, which is prose. So you can do things with prose that you can't do when you're speaking, because prose is visual. You can put a word at the center of a blank page if you wanted. Authors don't do that very often, but authors will do things with their prose. I think about Neil Gaiman's Coraline. If you've read Coraline, specifically, I'm thinking about early on, the door opens when Coraline is in bed, and the way that he writes it is the door opens and it goes creak. The word is separated like that, and that gives a feeling. And yes, I can say the word creak and stretch it out, but he's doing something different with the prose, a visual thing with the prose that I think sometimes it's translatable through speech, and maybe this one you would feel is translatable with just stretching out the word in speech, but sometimes it's not translatable, and I don't want to lose out on that. I like that. I find that interesting and powerful. Not everyone loves House of Leaves, but that is a good example of a book that I never think could become an audiobook, and that the consumer would get the same thing out of it than they would with the physical copy of the book. It would just be such a different experience. So even if it's not often, we do lose something when we lose the visual aspect of prose, in my opinion. So again, audiobooks aren't bad. I listen to audiobooks. I tend to listen to informational texts more on audio than I do fiction as a personal preference, but I have listened to fiction and enjoyed it as an audiobook. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I think if that's what people enjoy, then they should totally do it. And I have no problem with that, or don't think anything against them. But I will say that audiobooks don't count as reading. They are two different ways of consuming a piece of media, and both are great. But they're different, and they do different things in our brains, and they allow us to focus on different aspects of the media. so they're not the same. And I'll stand by that position. I don't think it should be a controversial take, but I like reading more than listening to an audiobook. So if you disagree, feel free to say so in the comments, or if you agree, you can say that too, or if you have any thoughts about anything that I said in this video, then I'd love to hear them.